the first thing that hits me is, because the most startling thing to me was when we start out in the very beginning of the book, and there's a 3-year-old sitting on a doorstep at night, totally left alone, and with no idea. And I was, even at that moment, I was torn between who I had the strongest feeling for. Because can you imagine, as a parent, leaving the child? And it truly has to be a choice between life and death. To leave a child, you have to be doing it, thinking you're saving their life by doing that, but with no guarantee that you are. What did any of the rest of you, how did you feel when you were reading that? I had moments of, how could they do that? No matter what, wouldn't you keep your baby? Wouldn't you hang on to it? And then, and of course, as you read through the book, you become more and more aware that obviously it was the right thing, but we all know it could have gone other ways. Did anybody else have any confliction between parenthood and a child, being left and making that kind of a decision? They were literally driven out of their home that night. They literally ran out with that child. Look how quickly they made that decision to leave the child. I mean, it wasn't like they took weeks thinking about it. They were pounding on their door and coming in, and in that length of time they had to decide. And then how do you know where to leave a child? Nancy?
Well, and they had spent weeks observing people being beaten and killed in the street.
Exactly.
And knowing their own background and the background of their child. No matter how much they didn't maybe look stereotypic, they were connected to a community that was under fire. So it was like, we're all three going to die, or maybe we leave her here, and because of who she is and because she's a child and the way she appears, someone will take her. We may be dead before we get to the train.
Yes.
So
yes.
They knew it was life or death.
Yes.
They
thoroughly believed that. And it, yes, Pat.
On the subject, I didn't realize, I've read different books about the other countries, and I didn't realize that Romania was considered the Paris of the East, of Eastern Europe. And I was amazed, because mostly what I knew about Romania was Dracula, and then presents
castles
a whole
and
scene of peasants and people believing, and, in this kind of magic or witchcraft or whatever. So that was really enlightening to read how cultured and really advanced they were.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, they were, and
family.
And certainly the family, as well as the adopted family, was very well off in the area, and we follow them through to close to disaster for them, and yes, how do you feel about what happened, the family that adopted her? And I hate that we're having to give away as much as we are of the story, but we just about have to. I know there's some here that haven't read, and believe me, we're leaving out lots of details. There's plenty more to read and appreciate other than what we're discussing too. So don't let this discourage you if you haven't read it. I really recommend the book. It's excellent. And I also thoroughly enjoyed that there are, there's pictures of her and her family in the back. So, I mean, feel free to look at the book afterwards if you'd like to and just see the pictures of the families that we're talking about. I mean, it gives a lot more reality to me when there's actually pictures to look at. I think, yep, they were real people. This isn't just a fictional story that's been made up. It's a real family. Yes?
Grace, I have read on and off for years, and it seems like our book lists have been flooded with stories of the oppressed during World War II. And I kind of reached that point of, well, I've read all of that, but I decided somewhere in the midst of it that these people, in fact, lived through this. And when I read that based on a true story, time and time again, when you pick up these books, how dare I think that I don't have time to spend a few minutes with those families. And I guess I'll just keep reading them. And every book opens up a new scenario for us, as this one did. A recent one, When We Were Yours, takes you through the Polish invasions. And so, you know, there's something new with all of these books, and the stories will go on, and it's, as Nancy pointed out, those people are still living it. They're still remembering every word of it. And I have time to share my time with them.
Yes.
Well, Grace, it seems like in different stories I've read about World War II, so many of the countries, their parents had to give up their children to save them, because the parents knew that they might not be able to be saved, and so they wanted their children to be saved. So,
Can
know,
you
we
all
have
hear
no
what
idea.
Pat's saying? That so many families had to sacrifice their children, give up their children, trying to save them. We know even in, look at England, how many of them were sent out of London during the bombing. The difference being you have a little better hope that those children are going to survive. You've sent them to countrymen, and that, you know, you're not just leaving them. So, but it's still in times of danger, I think your impulse is to bring your family together, stay close, face whatever it is, and get through it. And we realized through this that that's just not always the case. That sometimes we have to do the impossible and give them up. Let's talk a little more about the family that adopted her.
I think it was telling that the father of the family could get along with other people, and the man he let into his office, or let him live above him, although he was a radical compared to them at the time, they had discussions, they worked through things, and so it forms this bond between a very bourgeois, let's use the term, a businessman, a capitalist and everything, and he forms a bond with a person who is very much more socialist or even to a communist. And yet, this is a personal bond that they can show being established between people, even in the hardest of times that it comes.
Yes, coming from two totally different directions, and that they ended up, both of them, totally respecting each other. And of course, it led to, it had a lot of consequences to the story too, this relationship that, and what the father had done to help him when he needed help was never with any idea that he'd get anything back for it. And yet he was saved several times by that relationship. So yes, I think I love that you brought that up. I think that's one of the best things in the book, the relationship that can develop between two people from opposite ends, and how they can end up totally respecting and loving each other. And that never went away. They always did, up to the very end, why he was helping the family. I found it just heartbreaking, the gradual and the way they learned and had to accept that this is our new life, this is what it is, and in order to survive, this is what we have to do. And anybody want to address that?
I just thought that was some of the most moving passages in the book, when things, one little by little, were taken away from them and removed from their life as they had known, and especially their apartment. And I thought that was very moving, and just a lot of grief. The grief just continued through the book. First, with the child being left and the parents, the parental grief, but then as the family went through such more and more difficult times that they just couldn't even imagine.
The fact that burning firewood overnight and forgetting about it meant that they could not get more firewood, and so that the furniture was what kept them, what little warmth they had through the winter, is where they got their wood. And so I was thinking, when the communists came through and did the inventory, it was a lot down from what it would have been if they hadn't had this to survive through that previous winter, when he gave furniture in the living room, furniture, other things, the dresser, they all use, I forget what the word is, but clothing is not put in a closet. It's put in
Wardrobe.
It's a wardrobe. They given up the wardrobes and the stuff was out, so it was just.
And she as a child, not quite such a child, but she was giving up everything too, and she was losing everything out of her room. And she had to learn to live on a floor with other people with one bathroom, and she had to, and for a young person in many ways, that's hard. That's a hard lesson. They're not. Would anyone care to address what the piano meant in this story? How important was the piano to
Because
her?
I love music, it was always that escape. The piano is something, another language that all people can appreciate or can at least relate to, whether you can do it with a regular language, spoken language or not. And it was her escape. She did well on it.
It pretty much became the most important thing in her life, except for her parents, of course. But yes, and the parents realized how important this was to her. I mean, they could have early used the piano, trade it, sell, do anything. They could have done a lot with that piano, and yet they were telling her, we have to be careful when you play, we don't dare let anybody see where the piano is. They realized that it was in danger, and they protected it as long as they could, that's for sure. And I thought that was another really enjoyable part of the book, that she had that and could hang on to that as long as she did. It was amazing how long they hung on to that piano. It was one of the last things to go.
I felt like it was also a sign of such hope that was woven in and out of the story, because I got the feeling at the end that's what she became in New York.
Which she did, yes, exactly. So there was, yes, exactly. So, yes, she was definitely gifted, because she was playing from such an early time in her life. And it definitely followed through for her, didn't it, when she got away. Nancy?
I have a question that's come up here. I was just Googling questions.
Uh-huh.
And it says, when Despina, that's the adopted mother,
Uh-huh.
receives the letter from Natalia's birth mother,
Mm-hmm.
she is forced to make a decision about whether to share that letter with her daughter. Do you think you would have done the same thing in her position? You know, she didn't have to ever relate that information to this child that she had been hers, that she wanted so desperately since he was 3.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we have to keep in mind, in even answering that question, how important this child had become to her. She had so wanted children and not been able to, and this child was so important to her. So yes, anybody have any feeling on that? How would you answer that?
It's kind of a happy scenario that she did, in the fact that at the end of our novel, and the ability to at least know
Mm-hmm.
some of those individuals, not that it made up for all those years, and didn't make her adoptive parents any less her parents. I thought that was such a worthwhile thing, because it gave hope on both sides, really.
They got enough information to know that the daughter had survived and she was alive. And so that was a hope that they could have, even though they weren't living under the communists. They knew that their daughter had survived. And I think that the biggest problem to start off with is the fact, did she survive, did she survive, did she survive? And they figured they found that out. And so having had that, that string or something to hang on to, was that this person is alive and she can, she's still going. So that's
Vindication of
vindication
the
for what they've
decision.
done.
Yes, yes.
This is a good one. I have read it. In a critical moment, when Natalia is ill, you remember when she becomes desperately ill
Yes.
and needs to get to a hospital, a Nazi soldier decides to save her life because he also has a daughter. Were you surprised by this display of humanity? And do you think he would have done the same thing if he knew Natalia was of Jewish descent? Because that's a one-on-one encounter. One man, a desperate mother, a very sick daughter, and he himself has a daughter,
Yeah.
and he chose to help.
It's a
Okay,
hard
that-
question because because we know a lot of the Nazi officers that were killing in large numbers also had families and children, and it wasn't affecting them. But you would hope maybe that because it was a one-on-one and one child, that maybe, that for him it,
I don't think parentalhood for a soldier in combat facing possible death anytime he is out, I don't think he would have had the nerve, if he had known that she was of Jewish descent, to have helped her. Just because of possible repercussions on himself or his family. I don't know. Because the decision was made rather quickly.
Interesting things have happened sometimes during wartime, hasn't it? I think about the World War I, where on Christmas Eve,
Both sides.
yes, both sides stopped, joined together, so we know all things are possible, right? And, you can only hope he would make the right decision whether he knew or not. And, yeah. Yes,
I must confess I had not read the book, but when I saw it was going to be reviewed, and since I've heard all this, I'm anxious to read it. Most of you all know we went to Warsaw, and I was one of them that was fortunate enough to go. But Leroy and I had taken, along with Butler and Martha, a small group of this youth choir to all of the Eastern European countries in the 70s. And so when we were in Warsaw at the church, I just asked Carol if I knew they went to Warsaw, if they got to see the church where we were supporting the group there. Our church is supporting. But anyway, when we were there in 72, the young people were singing this Baptist church there, because we were trained Baptist in those days. Anyway, they sang, and so I went this time, when Bob was talking, our pastor Bob, was talking through an interpreter, he said that there's a lady who was introducing our group. There were 5 of us. And he said, there's a lady here that came in 1972 with her husband, and they brought a group from San Antonio, and they sang in this church. If there's anyone that is in it, when the interpreter heard him say that, he interpreted it. He said, the pastor, and he said, maybe some of you that might have been survivors would like to come and meet her. So 2 people came up to Cindy. One was a 90-something-year-old man. He stood singing in the choir there. And he said, he talked to me through Arena. If you haven't met Arena, you're talking about a story. She needs to write a book because she lived in Bucharest. No, she didn't live in just a minute, it'll come to me. But anyway, what was part of Russia? Anyway, she was interpreting for us. She's the one who was responsible for our knowing there are new members in our church. I would love you all to meet her. But anyway, they told her, and so she came and interpreted for me with this man. And his comment was the same thing as a little 75-year-old woman who said she was small at that time, but she remembered our choir coming and singing it. And both of them made the comment that they couldn't believe that we came to them in the years that it was so dangerous to come. And they were so appreciative. And our young people, if we took those 4 summers, said that it changed their lives. And I think if our young people could go to places like this, it would be wonderful, because they have no idea what they enjoy each day. When they see something like that. Of course, that's where the ghetto was. It's a sad story, but they went. Belarus is where she's from.
Oh, okay.
It was part of Russia.
Yes,
And
yes.
she has a wonderful testimony, very deep Christian. But I just thought, this puts it to where we're living right now. We're giving money to that church that has now a Presbyterian congregation worshiping in their building.
Well, you're right, and there's so much we want our children to know, and as much as you can without living through something, but that goes for a lot of us too. And books like this certainly help us to do that.
Well, we did spend the summer, or 3 weeks of the summer, in Eastern Europe. And starting over in Romania and then heading westward, we saw those countries that we were forbidden to see when we were living in Germany, when Harold was in the military. So everything we saw was a new sight. But at our age, when we look back to 30 or 40 years, it doesn't seem quite that long ago as it did when we were much younger. And so to be able to interface a little bit with people our age who lived through this period of time was very insightful. It was probably one of the best parts of the trip.
This is not just in Budapest, but in this whole area. There's the book is going to cover these people had barely had some freedom, and the Nazis came in, and that was bad enough for them. But then after the Nazis came in, the communists came in, and it wasn't really liberation. It was a change that they were put under a system serving Russia. And so it was there. More recently than that, we had the breakup in the former Yugoslavia, and we visited in the Serbia to start off with, and we had a person come on board the ship who gave us what you might call a white paper for the Serbs. They feel like they've been falsely accused of what they had done. And then we went across the river into Croatia, and we visited a very small little community, but it was one that the Serbs had completely destroyed. And
that community would not give up, would not knuckle under to Serbian takeover, which some of the other satellite countries did. They just caved in. But Croatia and this area did not. So they were pounded for almost 3 months with bombing, and so it was pretty well raised. The whole community was. And then, of course, when they took over, there was a lot of animosity against these holdouts.
The Serbs also forced these people out of the community, and seeing this in their video, what was happening, was just before we went north to see what had happened in Poland when the Nazis came in. And so it was very reminiscent to see that, and there's a foreshadowing of how men, women, and children, mainly the older people, are the ones that is being forced out. But one of the things, we're in a church now, and one of the church buildings they've redone was their church. But as we're redoing these other things, they redid everything except one wall. And it sort of bothered Nancy, because every time you
go to church and you think, here is where I try to make peace with myself and with the world. But they left exposed all this war damage inside their church. So you got this beautiful, redone, everything glorious. But anytime you looked to your right, there's this alcove that reminds you, your neighbors to the north bombed and murdered your citizens. And as I said, at my age, many of these people remember that. They were young adults. They remember that. So it's kind of like and someone there said, well, they're not quite ready to forgive to that extent yet, because they suffered so much.
One of the things in the church, though, that we thought was very meaningful, there was a cross, and it wasn't a cross, it was a form of...
It had been a statue of Jesus.
But as with other things, the statue of Jesus had been charred in fighting.
And it had fallen from wherever it was, so it was missing an arm, it was missing a leg. But they had cleaned it up, and this black figure that's quite wounded is on near their chancel area as a reminder that Jesus sympathizes and knows your pain. And I thought that was truly a wonderful tribute. If you needed to have a memory of what had happened, that's a memory of the suffering Jesus who understands where you have been. But if I can skip back to Romania just a moment, we were really amazed by the country, and you look at the city and realize they took one side of the war, and then before the war was over, they took the other side. So consequently, both sides hated them. They'd either been on the side that murdered them before, or now they were on the other side. So Romania was caught in a real political bind, as it were. They changed their minds in the middle of a continental war and suffered greatly from that. But I could envision, Harold read this while we were on the trip. He said, I don't usually internalize stories, but this one woke him up a few mornings because he'd been reading it, fell asleep, and was dreaming about it. And then we went out and saw the way some of those cities are constructed, and we could envision that little girl being left on one of those, doorsteps of a hotel, just hoping that somebody would pick her up and save her. So that's kind of our bit. But it amazed me, I'm 74, it amazed me 30 years ago, some of these things happening in the southern part where Croatia and Serbia and those 6 that had been held together under Tito, when he died and they split apart, and you had 3 strong men who wanted to control everything. And Croatia has a coast. So not only did it have a lot of other benefits, it had a coast. So this struggle to who was going to dominate next is still in the mind of people our ages. They know the woman that we had lunch with who hosted us in her home in Croatia said that when this happened, her husband was Serbian. And when Tito died, he went back to Serbia, and she stayed with their son in Croatia. And she said, the only thing he ever sent me were bombs. So the hatred is still there because there are so many of the population who remember this struggle. And then we were impressed, because we're both kind of historians as our background, that when we were reading about this part of the world, I don't recall reading about who was called the Impaler, something the Impaler? Vlad. Yes. This kind of barbaric, show your enemy what a terrible, terrible conqueror I'm going to be if you don't knuckle under. That's a part of the history of this world, too. So you can understand a little bit better how that hatred of those who have back and forth run over your country and taken it by force, it's still a real present part of their history, too.
Just in case you're not really up on impaling,
Don't get too graphic.
impaling would be like a form of crucifixion. They stick a post through a man's posterior and run it out through his neck, goes right straight through his stomach, and he's left there to die.
And then, of course, it's put in the ground.
But this is in the area of Transylvania, where we get
Which is northern Romania.
No, northern Romania. But this is the story where we get Dracula, and this particular grandfather or father of Dracula is the man that he'd won a small battle against the Southerners coming at him, and he knew that the small force that he had scrimmaged against was going to come, the big force was going to come. And he literally took the POWs that he had, and he impaled 1,000 of them across the advancement route. And when the major force came, they saw this thousands of people impaled and knew that should you lose,
There's no mercy here.
no mercy here.
Right.
Anyway, that's why he's called the Impaler. He did it to over 1,000 people.
So we think 30 years is nothing, but in that part of the world, really, the historical mind goes back 400 or 500 years on what has happened and who did it. And part of it's folklore and part of it is real. But we found it a fascinating, beautiful part of the world, but they are truly emerging. Like they are some of these countries are now a part of a zone in Europe where they're allowed to do that. You know, you don't have to have a passport to go from my country into this country, but they haven't been accepted into the European Union yet, so they still have their own money. So Harold and I were doing the figuring out of the own money all the way across Southern Europe, but they're trying to bring their economy up to such a place that they can be a part of their more Western neighbors. But Romania and the places that we saw were quite lovely, but the scars of the previous wars are still showing.
I don't know about you, but I am a Snoopy book reader. I want to look and see if there's any pictures inside. I want to know if there's any information at the back. I want to read about the author. And so let's begin by reading about the author. Her name is Roxanne Veletzos. She was born in Bucharest and moved to California with her family as a young teen. Already fluent in English and French, she began writing stories about growing up in her native Eastern Europe. This is the story of her grandmother, and this book does not disappoint. Here is a picture of a charming 4-year-old girl with a big bow in her hair. At the top of the picture it says, "In anguish and despair, we release this child into the hands of God with hope and faith that she may be saved." This is a picture of Roxanne's mother about the time of her adoption. While the journey of Roxanne's biological grandparents was rooted in her imagination, the hardships suffered by her mother's adoptive family was sourced in truth, picking up, in a sense, where one left off and the other began, with the same underlying themes of resilience and courage in the face of tyranny. You've been talking about Romania, and obviously I wasn't here to hear, but in the beginning of the book, it informs us that according to the commission between October 1940 and the end of World War II, 380,000 Jews were massacred in Romania. In Romanian controlled territories. One of the most noted incidents happened in Bucharest. It took place in January of 1941, when thousands of Jews were dragged into the streets and tortured and killed. Grace, would you please let me know when it's time to stop? All right. Let's talk about the characters. First of all, the girl. We already know the story, but the characters tell it in such a heartwarming and poignant way. Bucharest, in January 1941, the girl sits alone, shivering. She wraps her arms around her tiny body and buries her face in the collar of her wool cardigan. Drawing her knees to her chest, she looks up at the building. She's never seen this building before. She's never seen this street. There isn't a person in sight. Her parents will be back any minute, she thinks. There are noises in the distance now, shouting, shrieking voices intermingled with rhythmic thumping of boots and windows slamming. The night is one of terror. Suddenly, sturdy arms reach down and embrace her, lifting her in the air. She's startled awake, and looking up, she sees the face of a woman she does not know. "Shh, shh," whispers the woman in her ear. The woman's face shines pale, like a wide moon. She looks at the child. 20 years she has been a concierge in this building. She knows this child does not belong here, does not belong to any of the neighbors. Now let's look at one of the characters, or two of the characters, that are not major characters, but integral. The knock at the door had startled Maria out of her dead sleep. Her first thought was that her husband was being called to witness the last-minute will. So she was so surprised when she opened the door, and there were two young people in their 20s. The woman was wearing no coat, only a thin cotton dress that was torn at the hem. It clung to her bare legs. By her side, a young, blondish man was shivering in his shirt sleeves. "We're so very sorry to barge in on you like this at this hour," the man muttered. "I was hoping we might see your husband." By the time Stephen slipped back into bed, the room was already bathed in the pink glow of early dawn. "Maria, I will tell you everything. But right now, I need to help them. Let me explain. I owe his father my life. Do you understand my very life?" It had begun the night before, just after supper, as the young couple was getting ready to turn in for the night. There were knocks at the door of their small flat. When at last she opened the door, expecting to see her neighbor asking for a cup of sugar, there was a police officer in a dark trench coat and a cap pulled low over his brow. "Is your husband at home?" he said politely. "If it's not too much trouble, I'd like to speak to him for a few moments." "May I let him know who's here?" "Good evening," she heard her husband say in the background. As they talked, she finished clearing the table, put their small child to bed, and she listened, quietly pretending she was asleep. "I have already answered all of your questions, officer," she heard her husband say in measured tones. "My father has never discussed professional matters with anyone, especially not me." "What are you speaking of, sir?" "The king's mistress, the woman who helped your father obtain his position, who brought in Jews like himself under the wing and cost him the throne. Do you not tell me that you do not know her?" The officer's voice was not restrained. It was just short of a yell. "I do not remember. I am sorry." You need to come with me to the precinct. Just protocol, you understand, but we have a few more questions. Should take no more than an hour. Your wife and your daughter, they need to come too. Why? He asked. They were beyond conversation now. It was done with, and he heard it in the silence that followed. Then he said, "Would you please let me speak with my wife? It might go easier. She gets rather emotional." And he looked at the officer, saying it to himself, "We are both men. We understand women and how delicate they can be." Quickly, he felt in his desk drawer. A stack of them were right where he left them. He stuffed them in his pockets. There was a look when he burst through the bedroom door, a brief, knowing look. No words. He lifted the little girl out of her bed. From the corner of his eye, he saw his wife grab a shawl and look for shoes. She ended up with slippers. And they began running. It was warm in the boiler room. It was warm and damp. They had been lucky, downright blessed. The guards at the front gate had their backs turned and were laughing and smoking a cigarette as the three slid right by them into the bowels of the building. "We can't stay here," he said, after the frenzy outside began to die down a bit. "We have to move on. We have to get to the other side of town tonight." And across town they made it. When they rested in this safe part of town, he looked away from her, knowing what he was about to say. He balled his fist, took a breath, and choked back his own tears. We have to give her a chance. If we leave her here in this building, people will find her, and she will have a chance. No one will turn away a small child. Then we can keep moving and come back when things are safer. Please just listen to me. No one knows who she is. No one knows who we are. She will be warm for the night. No one can turn their back on her. That's the story of the mother, the father, and the little girl. There's another story about the adoptive parents. The Russians came into Romania with their socialistic focus, and they too have a story to tell. And I encourage you to read this book. It reminds us that we cannot ignore tyranny, whether it's the bully in the office, the genocide of a nation. We must confront it, and tyranny cannot prevail. Thank you.